Hello, my name's Jeff Lamb and this is my second video for Facebook. This time I want to talk to you about a supervision group which I'm going to be running in about a week's time. The title of that group is Integrative and Relational, and I did at one stage consider using the term embodied, but I'm aware that a colleague who I've known for a number of years, Nick Totten, uses this term embodied relational to describe his therapeutic method, and the last thing I want to do is to tread on his toes. So I'm using the title is embodied sorry Nick, the title of this is Integrative and Relational. I will refer to embodiment or embodiedness at some stage in this video. We'll see how that comes in. The inspiration for running this group, I guess, could be said to have originated quite a while ago, probably 18 months, maybe even more, when I was the director of Interpsyche, which is a counselling training institute based within the NHS. I was the director, and one of my duties was that if a group didn't have a supervisor, because we were offering at that time on-course supervision, I would step in and sit in with the group. And one particular group I sat in with gave me some feedback later. One of the group gave it to me on the group's behalf. And this feedback was that whereas their previous supervisors, in fact they'd had two because we were, I don't know, various technical reasons why we did that, neither of those had focused much on the counsellor. Most of them had focused on the client and what was going on with the client and what to do with that client when these particular things were going on. Whereas I'd focused on the counsellor themselves, which one level I think they found a little bit challenging, shall we say. And part of the feedback was that they all had quite a lot to talk about in their therapy that week. Now, one might say perhaps that whatever I'd done with them was so traumatic that they needed the therapy to sort themselves out afterwards, but more positively, I truly believe, and certainly this student was of the opinion that it had stimulated a lot in terms of the student's individual process, which clearly on a counselling training is something we're trying to do anyway, so that they explore their own process and can become better counsellors as a result. So that interested me. I was flattered by the feedback, and it planted a seed inside me. So when I retired from Interpsyche, one of my projects post-retirement was to run a supervision group specifically on those lines. Lots has been said about working relationally in psychotherapy and counselling. We used to use two books as our kind of core texts on the subject. The book by David Mearns and Mick Cooper called Working at Relational Depth in Psychotherapy and Counselling. That was written quite a while ago. I remember I reviewed it in 2005. And more recently, about a year or so before I left, we started to use a book by Martha Stark called 3 Modes of Psychotherapeutic Intervention. Now, the first of those comes from what we could broadly call a humanistic perspective, and the second from a more psychodynamic perspective. I don't want to go into great detail about the ins and outs of those two books. I'm sure some of that theory may well feature in the supervision group that I'm running, but just to give you a broad background there. In terms of integration, well, the model that we used to use at Interpsyche, and basically the model I would say that I use myself as a practitioner, I would call integrative. My original training, again, it was in a sense integrative in that it was based on the work of Wilhelm Reich, and you could say, and I have done in an article I wrote about him, that Wilhelm Reich embodies, literally, elements of both the humanistic style and of originally a psychodynamic style. He was originally, if you like, a pupil in the sense, to the extent that Freud had pupils of Freud, and was part of that early Freudian circle. Although, as most people will know, had a lot of dispute with that circle, and I would argue that that was because of his essential humanism rather than subscribing to the perhaps some of the more, I would say, pessimistic elements of the psychodynamic model. So I describe myself as integrative, and for me it's a way that I like to work, and it seems to work well for both myself and the students that I ended up training. They seemed happy with it, I hope. So that's where those two terms come from, and we're going to try and fuse them into one approach to supervision. I guess one essential belief that I'm starting from is that whatever is going on in clients' lives, particularly in terms of how they conduct or manage their relationships, how they see their relationships, how they experience them, is going to come into the therapy room at some point in the process. And we can go further than that. We can say, well, maybe that is the work that we have to do. In a sense, it's nice to get background, to have a sort of picture, a snapshot of where did the client come from, a bit of history, a bit of, how might they have made the choices that they currently make about relationships, and so on and so forth. But the therapeutic work, the work that is going to promote change in the client, is going to be that which goes on between the psychotherapist and the counsellor. Now, that can be tricky, particularly because a lot of trainings may embrace that notion, and even I might say CBT embraces the notion of the necessity of a good working alliance. I see this somewhat differently, in a way that I kind of think that they're talking about getting the client on side, so that they're not at loggerheads with where the client thinks they want to go and where the CBT practitioner wants them to go. But as I say, even they take that into account. What they don't do, and what a lot of trainings don't do, and what a lot of supervisors don't do, is directly bring stuff in from starting with the counsellor or psychotherapist's own process or their own experience of the client's process, and actually bringing that into the room. So just very simply, an example of that, a client will say, I don't think people understand me, my wife doesn't understand me, my boss doesn't understand me. So the natural question for me to ask, am I understanding you? And that's quite a tricky one for a lot of clients, because at a head level, they think, well, that's your job to understand me. I pay you to understand me, and so why wouldn't you? That isn't the same thing, I would say, than the client actually feeling understood at an emotional level. And sometimes some of the work that I end up doing with clients is looking at that internal relationship between the rational part of them that believes that it's my job as the therapist to understand them, and therefore why would I be questioning that myself or putting it up for question? And the real visceral experience of actually Jeff sitting there nodding and making the right responses, but I don't feel understood. And that's where the power is in working relationally. Now, if I'm going to do that, immediately I make that intervention, I expose myself. Firstly, to the thing I've already mentioned, is that it seems irrational of me to put that as a question to the client. I'm actually, in that, trying to give the irrational part of the client permission to be there. But the client could easily consider, does this guy know what he's doing? Why is he questioning his own understanding, or encouraging me to question his understanding? So there's that bit of exposure. I'm also occasionally, not perhaps in that example, but in other examples, going to bring my own process into the therapy room and say, oh, okay, I'm feeling quite protective towards you right at this moment. What do you think might be causing me to feel that? What do you feel? Do you feel like you need protection? Or, where I feel a client, like a lot of clients are, is resistant, shall we say, to the therapeutic process, I'm going to bring that into the room in some way, encouraging them to say, well, how are you experiencing this therapy? Is it working for you? All of that exposes me. I could get a lot of criticism, I could get anger, I could get denigration, all sorts of things. And this is why I think it's difficult for counsellors and therapists, particularly when they're beginning, but also maybe further on into their practice if they haven't really had a background in how to do this. Bringing this into the room, they need to be supported in that. Supported in trusting their own perception, that it's okay to do that, and that the world isn't going to come to an end. As I said, in other areas, it's a very powerful way of working. When you start to work on this relational level, the parts which aren't working in the client's life are very exposed. They're there in the room. They don't have to talk about how some third party doesn't understand them and never will. And for the therapist in the situation, speaking personally, I'm often listening to a client talking about people in their lives, and you think, well, maybe they're right. Maybe this person never will listen to them or understand them. I don't know this for a fact. I can't say, but I also can't say that they will. So I'm sort of, talking very hypothetically. And whereas when you work in the relationship, it's all there in front of you. So that's why I like working in that way. And I guess if you, as a counsellor or psychotherapist, are interested in working in that way, then this would be a good supervision group for you. Because as I say, it's not that easy, it's not straightforward. And I know, because we built the whole interpsyche model around that way of working, it can feel counterintuitive to a lot of practitioners to bring their own and the client's process together into the room at the same time. I guess a lot of practitioners might be fairly comfortable with bringing the client's process into the room in the here and now, but bringing their own process into the room at the same time is maybe a bit more challenging. So that is where I come in, because I've been doing it for a long time, and I'm very good at seeing the points in the process, in the therapeutic process, at which that could usefully happen. Again, that's something of a skill that's difficult, or it takes a while to develop, and you develop an ear or a feeling for it. And I guess that's where I would bring in this term embodied. I use my body, the sensation in my body, or to know something doesn't quite feel right here. I don't know what it is. I've been as risky as to say, actually, I don't know what's going on here, but something doesn't feel quite right to me. How does it feel to you? To offer that possibility to the client, that maybe the client is experiencing the same thing. I very rarely had the response, no, it's just you. So usually that can be quite a useful barometer. So that's a good place sometimes to start. Another place is where there are elements of awkwardness at one level or another, mostly on the part of the practitioner, where I'm not really feeling quite on top of this, I'm not feeling comfortable with the feeling in the room, and is it me? And yes, of course, we're all human, we've got our own process, it could be. My acid test for that is, do you feel like that with all clients that you saw, or all the clients that you saw on that day? It could be. There might be stuff going on for you that day in your personal life, and clients can be triggering it. If it's not, if it's just that one particular client, then there's something going on in the relationship between the two of you. It's very useful to have somewhere to explore that. Obviously, we're not going to do therapeutic work here. The most I would ever do in that situation, whether it's in a group or a one-to-one, would be to point out the process to the client. And as I did with the supervision group that I sat in on at Interpsyche, to encourage the supervisee or student to take this piece of process to their therapist and to have a look at it there. Usually there is a combination of the two. My process gets triggered by your process. Maybe my process is quite familiar to me. I know that I have a particular response to certain types of people, certain ways in which people interact, how they relate. And I don't necessarily, I can clock that there's a bit of my process in there, and then I can find a positive use for that. I can say, yeah, I'm very sensitive to, I don't know, for example, this isn't a true example, that I could have quite a response to when I think somebody is trying to bully me, for example. That might be something that I've experienced a lot in the past, and I will be feeling it with the client. I'm not going to bring that in, not my process, but I can have some insight into what might be going on between me and the client. How could I work with that relation? That takes quite a bit of unpicking, and that would be the sort of thing we could explore. How do I bring that perception in? That hopefully gives you some sort of flavour of what we'll be doing. I don't want to make this video too long. So if this does interest you, and you happen to be free next Sunday, to live within striking distance of Forest Row in East Sussex, you'd be most welcome to come along and join us. I've priced it very reasonably. All the details will be on my Facebook page, and if you're looking at this video, I think there will be ways, either you'll be seeing it on the page or you'll get a link to that page. So all the details will be there, but if there's anything you'd like to talk to me about, or just give me feedback or get in touch and have a chat, you can get me on 07949 153 431, or you can get me on jeff231@mac.com. I look forward to hearing from you. Thanks for listening.